All right, welcome to lesson one, everyone. I am super excited to have you all here with me. Okay, so the first step is that, well, if we're going to be working in Blender, we need to have Blender downloaded. So you need to go to Blender's website, www.blender.org, and download a version. I will say that in this course, I am using Blender 4.1, which was released about a year ago at the time of this recording, and I really haven't found a need to upgrade it yet. So you can download Blender 4.1 or even the newest release at the time of this recording, which is Blender 4.4, because from the new updates that I've seen, none of it doesn't seem to matter or be different from what I'm doing. As a safe precaution, if you have not downloaded Blender yet, don't go for a version such as Blender 3.x or older, just for update reasons. Otherwise, we should be all set to begin. So when we open up Blender, we're going to start by going under New File and clicking General. And immediately we are greeted with this landing page. Before we get to modeling anything, we first want to get comfortable with the environment, since this lesson is all about navigating the interface, viewports, and modes. For free software, there are an incredible amount of tools that are given to us, so don't worry if everything looks intimidating right now. Okay, let's start from the top. Blender organizes your workflow using workspaces. These are the tabs at the top of the software, such as layout, modeling, sculpting, all the way down to scripting. If you highlight over any one of them, you could even see that it says Active Workspace showing in the window. So this helps you remind you that these are what workspaces are referring to. Let's go through them. So layout, this is your main area. This is a general space to preview your scene, and I like to think of it as a home page. Modeling is for modifying geometry with modeling tools. Sculpting is for modifying geometry with sculpting tools. UV editing is for mapping image texture coordinates to 3D surfaces. Texture paint is for coloring image textures. Shading is for specifying material properties for rendering. Animation is for making properties of objects dependent on time, which is really just what animating is anyways. Rendering is for viewing and analyzing rendered results. Composting is for combining and post-processing of images and rendering information. Geometry nodes are for procedural modeling that use geometry nodes. And scripting allows you to interact with Blender's Python API and writing scripts. There are a lot of them, but we're only going to be looking at really a couple or a handful of them. So as a small tip, you can actually customize and save your own workspaces. You could do so by clicking on this plus sign next to the workspace to add it, and we can immediately see that there are a bunch more that exist, but we're not going to be covering anything since they don't relate to modeling. We can also click on any workspace that we have in our toolbar, right click, and we could see that we could duplicate, delete, and reorder them. But I typically like the default layout. It works just fine for me. Of course, before the workspaces tab, we have standard software tabs for file management and basic actions, all the typical stuff. Okay, next thing we're going to be looking at is this giant scene over here, which is called the 3D viewport. This is your creative canvas and where all the magic is going to be happening. We know that this is the 3D viewport because in this button on the very top left of the lighter gray bar and below the workspaces, when I click it, it opens up a list of all accessible editors. So yes, the 3D viewport is also considered an editor, and 3D viewport is highlighted in blue here. We're going to be using this workspace a lot, so let's break it down. This dropdown next door gives us a list of modes to work with. The common ones that you're going to see yourself using are object mode and edit mode. These next buttons are options which are organized by actions we may want to do. These middle buttons are some additional niche tools for transformations and orientations. On the right-hand side, the first button allows us to select, gives us select invisibility options, which I can showcase using this mesh right here. This cube is a mesh. So disabling the eye will hide it. Disabling the selecting prevents me from touching it. The next one is the viewport gizmos, which enables and disables some additional controls, but it's also something I don't use very much. Next dropdown is viewport overlays, which enables and disables some pretty interesting things actually, such as we could take away the floor, the axes, even the 3D cursor, origins, really anything, as well as telling us statistics about our object, which will become very, very useful as we move on. At the end over here, we have the different viewport settings. First one is wireframe, which pretty much showcases all the edges of your shape's outline as if it were to be made from wires. Solid will just give you a nice solid mesh. Material preview takes your solid mesh and applies any materials that you have over it to preview it. And rendered would show what your mesh would look like in a rendered environment, which typically requires lighting setup and whatnot. The button before these viewport settings is toggling X-ray, which allows you to see through your mesh, such as if you were to have X-ray vision. But it only works in some of the modes. And the drop down in the end here is other viewport shading details, which are not very important right now. Okay, that's a lot of explaining tabs. Let's move on to basic navigation. With a mouse, you could use a mouse or a touchpad, but a mouse is very helpful when working in Blender. The left mouse button is for clicking. This allows you to select objects throughout your scene. Your right mouse button will open up a menu based on what was clicked. So for instance, I'm in object mode, so I'm going to get options tailored to objects. But in edit mode, for instance, if you go to another place and you right click, you might get a pop-up a little bit more tailored to what you're working with. Holding the middle mouse button or dragging this navigation gizmo over here will allow you to rotate your view. And depending on the touchpad that you have, you could also achieve this with 2-finger scrolling. Scrolling your mouse will zoom in and out of your view, which you can also do by holding down this magnifying glass and dragging your mouse. This hand icon, if you hold it down and drag your mouse, this is going to translate your view without rotating anything. These other two buttons on the bottom give you different views. One of them is from the template camera, and the other one is from a different projection. But these are not going to be used very much. Or at all, really. Lastly, back to the navigation gizmo, I can actually click on one of these axes buttons to change my view directly from the perspective of that axis. So if I click this positive x-axis, I could view my scene from the perspective of the positive x-axis. Hovering over these buttons will show me a shortcut on my numpad that I could use. A lot of people find this helpful, but I typically like to drag around my scene all from the mouse. So as you can see, this is just one of the editors that we looked at, and there are already so many controls that are not directly obvious unless somebody like me explains to you what they are, or you just play with them a lot. Luckily, as mentioned, this 3D viewport is one of the more popular places you'll see yourself working it, so you are going to get the hang of it very, very quickly. Next thing we're going to focus on is pretty much what has not been discussed yet on the remainder of the screen, which is these sections on the side. These sections are called areas. You might hear people referring to them as editor regions, or windows, anything that really gives the gist of what it is. These areas allow you to simultaneously view other editors. So by default, I have the outliner on the top right and the properties panel on the bottom right and a timeline on the very bottom. These thin black lines between areas separate one another, and because of how small they are, they can admittedly be a little bit finicky to work with. That aside, when we hover over these black edges, we can see that we get the option to change the size of the area by holding and left clicking. If we right click on the black edge, we open up a little menu giving us the option to add or collapse an area into each other. So for instance, if I split an area, let's say vertically, I get this vertical outline. And when I left click, it's going to split my current area into a new one along that line. And I could, of course, change this area into an editor that I want to use. Going back to that menu, if I choose swap areas, it does what the name suggests. It swaps the two areas along the edge of the black line that you clicked. Now, if your area starts to get very cluttered, like mine is right now, I can go back to that menu and click Join Areas. And this arrow over here indicates which area gets preference. For instance, if my arrow is pointing to the left, this means that the one on the right side is going to jump and join and ultimately take the space of what's on the left. Okay, everyone, stick with me here. We've only got a couple more modes to discuss left in this module. Of course, as a viewer watching this, you have the ability to pause and refresh yourself whenever. Great. Lastly, back in our 3D viewport, we have talked about this drop-down that switches modes. The default mode is object mode. This is where you're going to get the opportunity to select, move, rotate, and scale your prop, all without directly modifying the geometry of the object or mesh, which is what these geometric figures are really called. They're called meshes. These actions can happen with the tools on the side. So the first option is the select box. This allows us to select objects with no controls. We could even drag our mouse to box select. Next one is cursor, which changes where the cursor is located. As a small way how to get this cursor back, you can press Shift S and hover over cursor to world origin. Don't worry about that pop-up. I just want to give you a way to get the cursor back to where you initially had it. Next, we have the move tool, which when an object is selected, this allows us to translate an object along an axis if we drag the arrow, or along a plane if we drag the little square. We can even see this effect taking place by clicking this arrow next to the navigation gizmo or pressing N on my keyboard. As a brief heads up, objects have origins, which are these little orange dots, and the information that gets relayed to us in this transformation menu is all with respect to the origin. So in this case, my cube here is located at world origin. This is the point where all the axes meet together, 0.000. And if I do any of the controls earlier, you could see that the transformations menu updates and changes appropriately. Now to move it freely, I could drag the white circle, and this will allow me to translate the object along the plane according to my view. This one's a little bit tricky to explain, but if you can imagine in 3D space, your screen was a plane, the object will move along that plane. A good way to visualize this is that if you take a piece of paper and you hold it up in front of you, and wherever you look, that piece of paper follows your eyes. That piece of paper acts as the plane in your view, and the object is going to move along that plane. Another example, let's say in Blender, if I click this x-axis to view everything from the positive x direction, my screen's plane is now in the YZ plane. So if I move the object anywhere, you could see that it's going to move the Y and Z axis, but the X one is not going to change at all. In addition, I could also move the object by selecting it and pressing G in my keyboard. G is for grab, same thing as move, and it will have the same effect as moving that white circle. After pressing G and you are in this mode, I can then press X, Y, or Z on my keyboard to lock the movement to a respective axis. And if I press the same letter again, it will take me out into this free movement. And to get out of the mode entirely, I can click Escape on my keyboard to put my object in the state it was before I entered the mode. And a lot of these tricks are going to be very common in the next couple of tools. Next, you have the Rotate tool, which will rotate your object around a specific axis. And these axes correspond, like the colors of it correspond to the same ones in the gizmos. So red is the x-axis, for example. Similarly, this white circle allows me to rotate the object based on the axis through the screen. So if you can imagine taking a rod and poking it directly through the center of this white circle, you could then rotate your object around that rod. After selecting an object, you could also press R on your keyboard to give you that white circle rotation. Then pressing X, Y, or Z in this mode will lock it to a specific axis, and you can leave out the same way. Pressing the same letter will give you back the free movement. Escape will take you back to the state it was before. After that is the scale tool, which allows you to scale your object along an axis. Or if I drag the white circle, it will scale my object proportionately across all axes. Likewise, I can select the object and press S on my keyboard, S for scale, which will give me that white circle scaling. Pressing X, Y, or Z will lock it to a specific axis. And similarly, I could exit by pressing the same letter, escape to get it to the state before. I get it. We're used to how it works by now. Of course, in case I have not mentioned it, or if you've not figured it out yet, if I want to scale and I want to confirm these changes, I just need to left click, and my transformations menu will update and save those changes that I've made. So I'm just going to undo that really quickly. Now, a lot of times with these tools, I like to use a mix of them with using these tools and also just manually setting the location in this transformations menu. So for instance, if I know if I want my object to be at x is equal to 2, I could just input that directly without needing to drag it and precisely waiting for it to be at x is equal to 2, for instance. It all depends on the situation, what's comfortable and more suitable in the moment. After these three main tools, you have the transform tool, which is this one right here. And this pretty much just combines the three tools that you've seen so far into one super tool. As a personal note, I rarely use the transform tool since I find it easier for me to work specifically with the action that I want. There's also no keyboard shortcut to enter this mode, such as T for transform, and it's for really two main reasons. One, if you were to press T to enter transform mode, Blender doesn't know specifically which transform you want. Do I want to translate, rotate, or scale my object? And the second reason is, if you do press T, this one is already reserved to hide and reveal those tools in object mode. Anyways, next we have the annotate tool, which allows you to draw on your screen and erase in one of the subtools. Now to get those subtools, just like all of these boxes with a little arrow on the corner, I can hold it down to get all the subtools for little niche effects. So I could find my eraser right here and then erase the annotation that I've done. So as a heads up, when you annotate, the drawing is going to be on the plane according to your screen's view. So if I draw this happy face in this view, and then I rotate around the scene, you can see that the happy face is still going to be on the plane in which my screen was when I drew it. Now, I don't know a way to retrace my steps to get back to that screen's plane view once I've already moved on. So, of course, when I do choose to annotate, I would typically aim for a perspective which is easier for me to get back to. So, for instance, I know that if I click on this x-axis here to view the YZ plane, if I annotate in this perspective and I do something in my scene, move around, I know that if I click back this button, I can easily get back to where I was. Great. These last two tools, Measure and Add Cube, are very niche tools that I also never see myself using, but I'll cover them anyways. The Measure tool lets me measure distances by dragging a line, and angles by selecting somewhere in the middle of it and adjusting it. However, as you may have guessed, a lot of the times you are just eyeballing these measurements, and it's not precise enough for me to find it valuable. You could also see me like if I were to press Control Z to undo this action, it will just bring up something that I have already moved on from. So if you're not careful, this can get annoying very, very quickly. The add cube feature, this allows you to add a cube, or really a rectangular prism, by dragging a rectangular face and then adding it some width with another click. Again, this one is also quite niche, and I find it easier for me to just add a default cube and configure it however I want, just like adding anything else to the scene, which we're going to be discussing later. But again, it's not something that I find super useful, and I'm not going to be talking about it. Okay, that was a lot of information with object mode, so if you need to catch yourself back up, feel free to do so. These sort of actions are quite common, so it's best for me to explain all of this to you up front so that you're comfortable with it moving on. Okay, the next common mode is edit mode, which we're only going to talk about a little bit. And to get into edit mode is for modifying geometry. So we need to click an object or select an object with geometry, allowing us to go into edit mode. And this is where you will actually change the shape and spend the bulk of your time modifying that mesh's geometry. All the tools to complete this will be discussed in an appropriate lesson down the line. I'm thinking chapter 2. But yeah, one handy shortcut to get here is to press the tab key on your keyboard, which will switch between object and edit mode. So if you ever watch other Blender related videos and you've heard the term tab into edit mode, this is what they're referring to, pressing the tab key to go from object mode into edit mode. All right, great stuff. We've covered a lot of information in this lesson, and now I want to give you the opportunity to practice getting comfortable moving around Blender. So, as a practice challenge before the next video, I want you to try to navigate around this cube by zooming, panning, and rotating, switch into edit mode and back, switch the viewport settings, such as wireframe, solid, etc. Take a look at the different workspaces, and moving and modifying the location of this default cube. It doesn't really matter to me if you messed up anything, because ultimately we didn't do anything. And we could always start with a fresh new file before we get into building a prop, for instance. Finally, as a last piece of reassurance for you, just know that even 5 minutes of playing and poking around and having fun in Blender is going to make a huge difference. Exploration is a huge part of Blender. And by completing this video, I hope that you should now understand the core layout of Blender and really how to get around. So, I'll see you in the next lesson where we will discuss good practices on using the outliner and scene cleanliness.